A damp autumn morning. A rusted transit van idling in an alleyway. A shivering 10-year-old girl tugging at the sleeve of a royal guard who just wants his shift to end. He broke protocol to look inside. What he found didn't just cost him his badge, it broke his reality. The wool of the ceremonial tunic was a torment. It was thick, stiff, with a century of tradition, and currently chafing the raw skin at the back of Gideon Croft's neck. He stood perfectly rigid, his chin parallel to the grey cobblestones of the plaza, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. Around him the city buzzed with the mundane chaos of a Tuesday morning. Tourists swarmed like brightly coloured insects, their camera flashes bouncing off the polished brass buttons of his chest. Gideon hated the tourists. He hated the smell of their sugary pretzels, the loud, flat vowels of their complaints, the way they treated him like a wax figure installed purely for their amusement. He was 32 years old, a former infantryman who had seen the ugly, dusty end of a roadside skirmish. And now his primary battlefield was avoiding a sneeze while a man in a neon windbreaker made faces at him. His boots were tight. His lower back screamed with a dull, throbbing ache that he tried to ignore by wiggling his toes inside the heavy leather. 40 minutes, he thought, staring at a stain on the pavement. 40 minutes until the changing of the guard. Then a pint. Maybe 3. He didn't see her approach. She must have slipped under the thick velvet rope, separating the military installation from the civilian walkway. 1 second he was staring at the stain. The next, there was a sharp, frantic pulling at the seams of his trousers. Gideon did not look down. Protocol dictated he remain immobile unless actively threatened. But the tugging didn't stop. It wasn't the hesitant poke of a daring teenager. It was desperate, violent. "Please." The voice was thin, raspy, scraping against the ambient noise of the plaza. Gideon's eyes flicked downward just a fraction. She couldn't have been older than 10. She wore a puffer jacket 2 sizes too big, the synthetic fabric torn at the shoulder, leaking white stuffing like dirty snow. Her hair was a tangled mess of dull brown, plastered to her forehead with sweat and grime. But it was her hands that caught his attention. Her fingernails were bitten down to the quick, the cuticles bloody, and her fingers were trembling so violently they were vibrating against his leg. "Please, you have to come. You have to look." Gideon tightened his jaw. He wanted to shout for one of the roaming civilian police officers, but a quick peripheral glance showed the nearest bobby was halfway across the square, giving directions to a family of tourists. "I know you're not supposed to talk," the girl whispered, her breath hitching. She smelled of damp cardboard, stale street rain, and a faint, sharp odor of panic. "But there's a van, down the alley behind the bakers, the white one." Gideon swallowed, fighting the urge to tell her to clear off. He was a royal guard. He didn't investigate parking violations. "It's dripping," she choked out, her voice cracking. "It's dripping red. And the man, the driver, he looked at me. He had dead eyes, like the fish at the market. Please." A drop of rain hit Gideon's cheek. He felt a sudden cold prickle run down his spine, completely separate from the chill of the morning. It was an old instinct buried under 2 years of parade drills and brass polish. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of wrongness. He looked at her fully, now breaking his 1,000-yard stare. Her eyes were wide, the whites visible all the way around the irises. She wasn't trying to get a reaction for a TikTok video. She was terrified out of her mind. "Where?" Gideon's voice was a low gravel, rusty from hours of disuse. The girl gasped, shocked that the statue had spoken. She pointed a trembling finger toward the narrow slit of an alleyway, wedged between a high-end bakery and a closed-down souvenir shop about 50 yards from his post. "Just there," she whispered. "It smells like bleach. It smells like before my mum died in the ward." Gideon's thumb brushed the safety of his SA-80 assault rifle. It was loaded. They always were these days, ever since the embassy scares last year. The heavy metal felt cold and reassuring in his grip. If he stepped off this podium without an explicit order, without a direct threat to the gates behind him, he was looking at severe disciplinary action. Confined to barracks docked pay, maybe a discharge if the commanding officer was in a foul mood. He looked back at the girl. A tear cut a clean track through the dirt on her cheek. "Right," Gideon muttered. He didn't execute a crisp ceremonial turn. He just stepped off the wooden block. The heavy clack of his boots hitting the stone pavement echoed sharply. The tourists nearby went silent, a few of them instinctively stepping back, their phones lowering. They sensed the shift in his posture. He was no longer a prop. He was a soldier moving with purpose. He bypassed the velvet rope, his long strides eating up the distance. The girl scrambled to keep up, trailing a few steps behind him, like a stray dog. As he moved away from the open plaza, the noise of the crowd began to muffle, swallowed by the tall brick walls of the surrounding buildings. The air changed. The sweet buttery aroma of the bakery faded, replaced by the damp metallic stench of the city's underbelly. And beneath that faint but unmistakable was the sharp, clinical sting of industrial bleach. Gideon's stomach tightened. He unclipped the strap of his rifle, letting it rest easier in his hands. He didn't know what he was walking into, but the cynical voice in his head, the one that usually told him to mind his own business and wait for his pint, was dead silent. The alley was narrow, a claustrophobic canyon of stained brick and rusted fire escapes. As Gideon stepped into the shadows, the temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees. The cobblestones here were slick with a slimy mixture of moss and motor oil. About 20 yards deep into the gloom sat the van. It was a Ford Transit, an older model, its originally white paint job yellowed with age and choked with grey exhaust soot. Rust chewed at the wheel arches like a disease. It sat idling the diesel engine, producing a low rhythmic rattle that vibrated through the soles of Gideon's boots. He stopped, raising a hand to tell the girl to stay back. She obeyed instantly, pressing her small back against the damp brick wall, her eyes locked on the vehicle. Gideon approached slowly, his boots deliberately avoiding the puddles. The smell was overpowering now. It wasn't just bleach. It was the coppery, thick scent of old blood, mixed with something sweet and rotting, like garbage left in the sun, hastily covered up with harsh chemicals. He moved to the driver's side first. The window was rolled up, smeared with greasy condensation on the inside. He peered through the murky glass. Empty. A half-smoked cigarette sat in the ashtray, a thin ribbon of grey smoke curling toward the roof. The keys were gone, but the engine was running, hot-wired. Gideon's grip on his rifle tightened. His palms were sweating inside his white ceremonial gloves. He hated the gloves. They made him feel clumsy, insulated from the real world. He walked around the front of the van, scanning the shadows, checking the fire escapes above. Nothing, just the dripping of a faulty gutter. He reached the passenger side, empty too, but there on the beige plastic of the dashboard was a dark, smeared handprint. It was maroon, dried blood. He felt his heart rate spike, a heavy thumping rhythm against his ribs. He swallowed the dry lump in his throat and moved toward the back of the van. The rear doors were dented, scarred with deep scratches, as if someone had taken a key to the metal in a blind rage. The license plate was completely obscured by a thick layer of caked grey mud. It didn't look accidental. It looked like someone had deliberately slapped a handful of wet clay over the numbers. Gideon looked down at the pavement beneath the rear bumper. The girl hadn't been lying. A dark, viscous puddle was pooling on the uneven cobblestones, slowly creeping toward a blocked storm drain. The liquid was almost black in the poor light, but at the edges where it thinned out, it caught the dim daylight and gleamed a sick, rusty red. It was dripping from a tiny seam where the two rear doors met. Drip, drip, drip. He let out a slow, shaky breath. He should call it in. He should retreat to the plaza, grab his radio, and wait for armed police. That was the smart play. That was the protocol. But the radio earpiece was back at the guardhouse, and if there was someone bleeding out inside this metal box, waiting 10 minutes for a response, Unit could be the difference between life and death. "Hello!" Gideon barked, his voice loud and authoritative, bouncing off the brick walls. "Is anyone in there?" The diesel engine rattled. Nothing else. He slung his rifle over his shoulder. He needed both hands. He grabbed the heavy metal handle of the right door and pulled. It was locked. He rattled it, the metal clanking loudly. He looked closely at the locking mechanism. There was a heavy steel padlock securing a hasp, but whoever had closed the doors had done it in a rush. The hasp wasn't fully seated on the metal loop. It was jammed. Gideon swore softly. He looked around, his eyes landing on a rusted iron pipe, discarded near a pile of broken pallets. He picked it up. It was heavy flaking rust onto his pristine white gloves. He wedged the flattened end of the pipe into the gap between the doors, right above the jammed latch, and leaned his entire body weight into it. The muscles in his back strained, burning against the tight tunic. The metal groaned a high-pitched, agonizing screech. Snap! The cheap metal bracket holding the hasp gave way. The right door popped open an inch. A blast of freezing air hit Gideon in the face. It wasn't just cold. It was mechanically chilled like a meat locker. And with the air came a smell so foul, so deeply wrong, that Gideon actually gagged, stumbling back a step and covering his mouth with his forearm. It was the scent of ozone, raw copper, and human waste, magnified tenfold. He forced himself to breathe through his mouth. He stepped forward, grabbed the edge of the door, and yanked it fully open. The interior of the van was pitch black, save for a few glowing blue LED lights that pulsed rhythmically in the dark. Gideon reached into his pocket, pulling out a small tactical flashlight he carried against regulations. He clicked it on the harsh white beam cutting through the gloom. He expected to see dead bodies. He expected a cartel dumping ground. What the beam illuminated made his blood run cold, freezing him in place. His mind refused to process the geometry, the sheer clinical insanity of what he was looking at. The back of the van had been completely stripped and retrofitted. Stainless steel panels lined the walls, gleaming dully in the flashlight beam. Thick bundles of black cabling snaked across the floor. Suspended from the ceiling were 6 clear plastic pods, like oversized, translucent cocoons. They were swaying gently with the vibration of the engine. Tubes, dozens of them filled with dark red fluid, snaked from the top of each pod, feeding into a large, humming centrifuge bolted to the cab partition. Gideon's flashlight beam trembled as he moved it to the nearest pod. There was a person inside. A young man completely naked, his skin pale and waxy. His eyes were closed, his chest rising and falling in a shallow, unnatural rhythm. A thick plastic mask covered his nose and mouth, attached to an oxygen tank. But it was his neck that made Gideon drop the iron pipe, the metal clattering loudly on the cobblestones. Tattooed on the side of the boy's neck, right over the jugular, was a fresh, bleeding barcode. And stamped beneath it in stark black ink was the royal crest of the family Gideon had sworn his life to protect. Gideon stumbled backward. His heel caught on an uneven cobblestone, and he fell hard against the damp brick wall of the alley. The impact knocked the wind out of his lungs, but he barely registered the pain. His mind was violently rejecting the image burned into his retinas. He stared at the open doors of the van, the cold, chemically chilled air pouring out and wrapping around his ankles. The rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum of the centrifuge inside sounded like a mechanical heartbeat, loud and indifferent. The royal crest. It was stamped right there on the boy's neck. Not a crude imitation, but the exact mathematically perfect heraldry that Gideon wore embossed on the brass buttons of his own uniform. The lion, the unicorn, the intricate shield. It was the mark of the sovereign tattooed with brutal precision over the lifeblood of a comatose child. Gideon ripped the white ceremonial gloves off his hands. He tore at them, tearing a seam, desperate to get the pristine cotton off his skin. Suddenly, the uniform he had worn with quiet, stoic pride felt like a straitjacket woven from lies. He threw the gloves onto the slimy pavement. His bare hands were shaking violently. He pressed his palms against his thighs, trying to force his body back under his command, but the adrenaline was toxic, flooding his system with a paralyzing mix of terror and absolute sickening clarity. "Is he in there?" The voice was tiny. Gideon snapped his head to the left. The little girl had crept closer, her filthy puffer jacket rustling. She wasn't looking at Gideon, she was staring into the cavernous dark of the van. "Is who in there?" Gideon choked out. His throat felt like it was lined with crushed glass. "My brother, Toby." She took another hesitant step forward. "He ran away from the group home last month. He said a man offered him a job sweeping up at the estate. He said they paid in cash." Gideon pushed himself off the wall. He needed to be a soldier. He needed to lock it down. He grabbed his tactical flashlight from where it had rolled near the puddle of blood. "Stay right there," he ordered, his voice cracking. "Do not move." He forced himself to step back into the freezing box. The smell of raw copper and human waste assaulted him again, but this time he clamped his jaw shut and breathed through his nose, letting the stench fuel a rising, hot anger. He moved the beam of light down the row of suspended plastic pods. 6 pods, 6 bodies, 3 young men, 2 young women, and a boy who couldn't have been older than 14. None of them were Toby, or at least Gideon prayed they weren't. They were all pale, their skin taking on the waxy, translucent quality of a mannequin. Thick IV lines tapped into their arms and necks, draining dark, oxygen-rich blood, while secondary lines pumped in a clear, viscous, synthetic fluid. They were being harvested. Not killed, not yet. Kept alive on an automated drip feed to serve as mobile living blood banks. Gideon aimed the light closer at the centrifuge bolted to the cab partition. Clear plastic tubes fed into the machine, spinning the stolen blood, separating the red cells from the plasma. And nestled beneath the machine, sitting in a refrigerated metal tray, were rows of heavy glass vials sealed with dark wax. Stamped into the wax of every single vial was the royal crest. His stomach gave a violent lurch. He turned away, bracing one hand against the stainless steel wall, and dry heaved. Nothing came up but a string of bitter saliva. The cynical part of his brain, the part that had spent years standing outside palaces, watching limousines pull up with diplomats and aristocrats, finally connected the dots. The rumors he'd heard whispered in the barracks about the sovereign's miraculously prolonged life. The quiet, hushed conversations about experimental treatments in Switzerland. It wasn't Switzerland. It was here. In the dirt in the alleys, draining the forgotten kids off the streets of the capital. Suddenly, the dashboard radio in the front cab cracked to life. Static hissed through the van, followed by a crisp, heavily modulated voice. "Unit 4, this is Control. Telemetry indicates a pressure drop in Pod 3. Confirm status of the cargo." Gideon froze. The voice was clean, dripping with an upper-class, authoritative cadence. It wasn't the voice of a street thug. It was the voice of a military dispatcher. "Unit 4 acknowledge. You have a 2-minute window before we remotely lock down the vehicle." 2 minutes. A sharp, distinct sound cut through the ambient noise of the alley. It was the heavy crunch of gravel being crushed under a hard-soled shoe. Someone was walking toward them from the far end of the alleyway, approaching from the street behind the bakery. Gideon killed his flashlight. Absolute darkness rushed back into the back of the van, save for the blinking blue LEDs. He stepped out onto the cobblestones, moving with agonizing slowness to avoid making a sound. He reached over his shoulder and unslung the SA-80 rifle. He didn't chamber around. The metallic clack would echo like a firecracker, but his finger rested parallel to the trigger guard. He looked at the little girl. She had heard the footsteps too. She was pressed flat against the brickwork, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with a primal, animal terror. Gideon pointed a firm finger at a stack of rotting wooden pallets near a rusted dumpster. He locked eyes with her and jerked his head. "Hide." She didn't hesitate. She scrambled under the lowest pallet, folding her small body into the shadows until she was completely invisible. Gideon flattened his back against the outside of the open van door. He held his breath. The heavy wool of his tunic scratched violently against his sweaty neck. The cold metal of the rifle was the only thing anchoring him to reality. The footsteps grew louder, rhythmic, confident. A shadow stretched across the slick, oily pavement, cast by the dim grey light filtering down from the narrow strip of sky above. Gideon tightened his grip on the rifle stock. He was a royal guard sworn to protect the crown, and right now he was about to beat the life out of someone on their payroll. The man who rounded the back of the van did not look like a monster. He looked intensely, brutally ordinary. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat, a slate-grey scarf neatly tucked at the collar, and carried a thermal coffee cup in his left hand. But his right hand was shoved deep into his coat pocket, weighing the fabric down with the undeniable heavy sag of a concealed firearm. He stopped when he saw the broken padlock lying on the ground. "Ah, hell," the man muttered. His voice was flat, annoyed rather than panicked. He didn't draw his weapon immediately. Instead, he pulled a sleek black smartphone from his breast pocket. That was his mistake. He assumed a junkie or a street thief had broken the lock. He didn't expect a fully armed infantryman waiting in the blind spot. Gideon didn't shout a warning. He didn't announce his presence. He launched himself off the brick wall, driving his heavy, polished boot straight toward the man's knee. It wasn't a clean, cinematic strike. The mossy cobblestones were slick with moisture. Gideon's left foot slipped a fraction of an inch, throwing his balance off. His boot struck the man's upper thigh instead of the joint. The man grunted, stumbling backward, dropping his coffee. The brown liquid splashed across the pavement, sending up a quick cloud of steam that smelled sharply of bitter espresso. His instincts were terrifyingly fast. He didn't try to catch his balance. He dropped his weight, letting the momentum carry him backward, while his right hand yanked a suppressed pistol from his coat. Gideon lunged. The heavy wool of his ceremonial tunic bound his shoulders, severely restricting his range of motion. He couldn't swing the rifle. Instead, he thrust the solid metal barrel forward like a battering ram, driving the flash hider squarely into the center of the man's chest. Ribs cracked with a sickening wet pop. The man wheezed spit flying from his lips, but his finger pulled the trigger anyway. Pfft! The silenced shot was barely louder than a pneumatic staple gun. The bullet tore through the excess fabric of Gideon's sleeve, entirely missing flesh, and embedded itself with a sharp crack into the brick wall behind him. Panic flared in Gideon's chest. He dropped his grip on the rifle's pistol grip, grabbing the barrel with both hands, and brought the heavy stock down in a brutal, sweeping arc. It caught the man on the side of the head, right above the ear. The sound was awful, a dull, heavy thwack, like a butcher's mallet hitting a slab of beef. The man's eyes rolled back. His knees gave out instantly, folding underneath him, and he hit the wet cobblestones like a sack of wet cement. He didn't twitch. He just lay there, a slow ribbon of dark blood beginning to pool from his hairline, mixing with the spilled espresso. Gideon stood over him, his chest heaving. His breath tore in and out of his lungs in ragged, burning gasps. The metallic taste of adrenaline flooded his mouth. He stared at the motionless body, waiting for the man to move, waiting for a trick. Nothing. Just the rattling idle of the transit van's diesel engine. "Is he dead?" The whisper made Gideon jump. He spun around, raising the rifle instinctively before lowering it just as fast. The little girl had crawled out from under the pallets. She was staring at the man on the ground, her face entirely devoid of expression. It was a terrifyingly blank look for a child. "I don't know," Gideon lied. He didn't want to check. He didn't have time. The dashboard radio crackled again. Unit 4. Lockdown initiated. Recovery team is 3 minutes out. Secure your perimeter. A heavy mechanical clunk echoed from the van as the electronic deadbolts slammed shut on the front doors. The engine cut out abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the hum of the centrifuge running on battery power in the back. 3 minutes. Gideon dropped to his knees beside the unconscious man in the charcoal coat. His hands frantically patted down the man's pockets. He found spare magazines, a slim leather wallet, and a set of heavy keys. He tossed the wallet onto the ground, ripping it open. No ID, no driver's license. Just a stack of crisp, uncirculated £50 notes and a black, unmarked keycard. He shoved the keycard and the keys into his trouser pocket. "Come here," Gideon ordered the girl, his voice tight. She walked over, stepping carefully around the puddle of coffee and blood. "What's your name?" he asked, grabbing her shoulders. He needed to ground her. He needed to ground himself. "Penny," she whispered. "Right, Penny. Listen to me very carefully. The people who own this van are coming. They are not the police. They are much, much worse. If they find us, we are going to disappear." He stood up, looking at the heavy SA-80 in his hands. It was a beacon. Walking down the street with a military assault rifle was a guaranteed way to draw every armed response unit in a 3-mile radius. He couldn't take it. He unclipped the magazine, shoving it into his belt, and threw the heavy weapon into the dark recess of the rusted dumpster nearby. It landed with a muffled thud in a pile of damp cardboard. He turned to the open back doors of the van. He couldn't save the kids inside. If he unplugged them, they would bleed out in minutes. If he stayed, he would be dead, and the Crown would sweep the whole thing under a thick rug of state security. The only way to stop it was to expose it. He leaped into the back of the van, ignoring the smell. He moved past the clear pods, trying not to look at the royal crest bleeding on the boy's neck. He reached the cab partition. Next to the humming centrifuge clamped to a steel arm was a ruggedized tablet running the telemetry software. Gideon grabbed it with both hands and yanked violently. The steel arm bent. He yanked again, planting his foot against the partition. The mounting bracket snapped, tearing the power cables out with a shower of blue sparks. He tucked the heavy, rubberized tablet under his arm and jumped back down to the alley floor. "We run," Gideon said, grabbing Penny's small, dirt-caked hand. He didn't look back at the guardhouse. He didn't think about his pension or the pint he was supposed to have, or the brass buttons on his uniform. That life was over. The man who had stood perfectly still for the tourists was dead. Gideon sprinted toward the far end of the alley, dragging the little girl into the shadows, just as the distant, high-pitched whine of an approaching siren began to cut through the damp autumn air. They hit the main thoroughfare just as a black unmarked SUV aggressively mounted the curb at the mouth of the alley behind them. Gideon didn't look back. He kept his grip on Penny's hand, tight, too tight probably, but she didn't complain. She matched his frantic pace, her small legs, pumping her breathing, coming in sharp, ragged whistles. The wool tunic. It was a beacon. He might as well have been carrying a flare. The bright scarlet fabric and gleaming brass buttons screamed his identity to anyone glancing in their direction. He needed it off. Now. He veered left, dragging Penny down a narrow service corridor, wedged between a pub and an Indian takeout joint. The air here was thick with the heavy scent of roasted cumin, stale lager, and rotting cabbage. A rusted iron staircase led down to a basement door, propped open with a crumbling brick. "In!" Gideon hissed. They slipped into the dimly lit cellar. It was a beer storage room. Towering silver kegs stood like silent sentinels, the concrete floor sticky with layers of spilled alcohol and dirt. Gideon dropped the tablet onto a wooden crate and immediately began tearing at the heavy brass button of his tunic. His fingers were clumsy, slick with freezing sweat. He popped one button completely off. It pinged against a keg and rolled into the dark, echoing loudly in the cramped space. He shrugged the heavy wool off, shivering involuntarily, as the damp basement air hit his sweat-soaked undershirt. He bundled the tunic up, shoving it brutally behind a stack of empty cardboard boxes. He was left in dark trousers and a plain olive-drab thermal shirt. He looked less like a soldier on parade and more like a weary dock worker. It would have to do. He leaned back against a keg, his lungs burning. He closed his eyes, pressing the heels of his bare hands into his eye sockets until bursts of static color exploded in his vision. "You just assaulted a Crown operative. You just abandoned your post." The realization felt like swallowing a stone. Treason. That was the charge. If they didn't put a bullet in the back of his head in a quiet parking garage, he would hang for it. A small hand tugged at his olive sleeve. He opened his eyes. Penny was staring up at him, her face smudged with alley dirt and engine grease. "Are they going to kill Toby?" she asked. Her voice didn't shake. It was terrifyingly steady, hollowed out by a life that had demanded she grow up far too fast. Gideon looked at the heavy, rubberized tablet resting on the crate. The screen was still glowing faintly, projecting a harsh blue light onto the surrounding kegs. "I don't know," he said. It was the only honest answer he had left. He picked up the device. The screen was cracked spiderweb style across the top right corner, but the software was still running on battery backup. He tapped the glass. A sprawling spreadsheet filled the display. Columns of names, ages, blood types. And next to each row, a GPS coordinate and a status marker. Harvesting, transit, depleted. Gideon scrolled down his thumb, hovering numbly over the glass. Hundreds of rows, all of them forgotten kids. Runaways, the undocumented, the invisible. People nobody would look for. Then he saw it. A secondary tab labeled Distribution. He clicked it. The screen shifted, loading a manifest of addresses. They weren't research hospitals. They were private estates. Penthouses in Mayfair, manors in Surrey. The names attached to the deliveries weren't patients. They were lords, ministers, CEOs. The elite of the country purchasing synthetic youth paid for in the stolen blood of the underclass. The Crown wasn't just hoarding the supply. They were selling it. A muffled thud echoed from the ceiling above them. Heavy boots crossing the floorboards of the pub. Gideon froze. He killed the tablet's screen, plunging the basement into near-total darkness, save for the weak yellow light filtering down the service stairs outside. He pulled Penny close, pressing a finger to his lips. She nodded, burying her face into his side, making herself as small as possible against his leg. The heavy rhythmic tread moved directly over their heads. It didn't sound like a local police patrol. It sounded tactical, organized. 3, maybe 4 individuals, silently sweeping the premises. Dust drifted down from the ceiling joists, settling lightly on Gideon's shoulders. He held his breath until his chest physically ached. He thought about the man in the charcoal coat, the cold mechanical efficiency of the lockdown. These weren't people who knocked on doors and asked questions. They were cleaners. A shadow fell across the concrete steps outside the basement door. Gideon shifted his weight, sliding his hand into his pocket. His fingers closed around the heavy ring of keys he had taken from the guard. It was a pathetic weapon against armed professionals, but he wasn't going to let them take the girl without tearing a throat out first. The shadow paused. A radio squawked a brief burst of harsh static that was immediately silenced. Negative. Service alley is clear. Moving to Sector 4. The shadow retreated. The heavy boots above moved away, the sound fading into the ambient rumble of the city traffic above. Gideon didn't move for 10 full minutes. He just listened to the dripping condensation from a nearby pipe and the frantic bird-like heartbeat of the child pressed against his ribs. When he finally exhaled, it was a long, shaky sigh. The immediate danger had passed, but the reality of their situation settled over him like a suffocating blanket. They couldn't go to the authorities. The rot clearly went straight to the top. The media would demand undeniable proof, and until they had decrypted the hard data behind the tablet's interface, it was just a stolen piece of hardware. He looked down at Penny. She looked exhausted, her eyes drooping, running on the absolute last fumes of adrenaline. "We have to go," Gideon whispered, lifting the tablet and tucking it securely into the waistband of his trousers at the small of his back. "Where?" she mumbled. "Somewhere dark," he replied. "Somewhere they won't look." He thought of his old squad mates, the ones who had gotten out of the service with their souls somewhat intact. Paranoid bastards living off-grid in the Highlands, hoarding encrypted servers, and a deep-seated hatred for the establishment. He needed a ghost, and he knew exactly where to find one. Gideon grabbed a discarded wool blanket from a chair in the corner and draped it over Penny's shoulders, hiding her torn puffer jacket. "Listen to me, Penny," Gideon said, crouching down to meet her gaze. "From this second on, we don't exist. We don't use real names. We don't look at cameras. You understand?" She nodded, clutching the frayed edges of the blanket. Gideon stood up. The stiffness in his back was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp purpose. He wasn't a royal guard anymore. He was a soldier behind enemy lines, and he held the detonator to the entire kingdom. He pushed the basement door open, stepping out into the cold, indifferent rain of the city. The truth hiding in the shadows is darker than you think, and Gideon's brutal fight to expose the elite is only just beginning. Will he and little Penny survive the hunt? If this raw, gritty thriller kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss the next pulse-pounding chapter of this story. The rabbit hole goes much deeper.